The echo of boots against the cold marble floor filled the courtroom. Each step Samuel Martinez took was a reminder of the burden he carried. He wore a worn-out suit that barely masked his history. A war veteran, a man marked by battles most couldn't imagine. But today he wasn't a hero. He was the accused. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the kind that crawled under your skin. Some eyes were filled with pity, others brimmed with judgment. Yet no one in the room knew the full story. Not even Samuel himself was sure how his life, once defined by discipline and honor, had unraveled into this moment of disgrace. As he sat on the defendant's bench, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes landed on the man presiding over the courtroom, Judge Miguel Duarte. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Miguel wasn't just a familiar face. He was Samuel's childhood best friend. Once closer than brothers, they had shared secrets, dreams, and the kind of unbreakable bond forged in the fires of youth. And now, Miguel sat on the other side of the room, robed in authority, looking at Samuel with a mixture of shock and sorrow. Adjusting his glasses, Miguel's expression hardened as he banged his gavel. His voice, firm yet strained, cut through the whispers in the room. "Order in the court. Before we proceed, I need a private moment with the defendant." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor raised an objection, but Miguel silenced him with a stern glare. "Samuel Martinez," Miguel said, his tone heavy with familiarity. "Step into my chambers." The weight in the room grew unbearable as Samuel rose to his feet. His mind churned, imagining every possible scenario. But nothing could have prepared him for the confrontation awaiting him. In the small office behind the courtroom, Miguel shed his judicial robe and draped it over the back of a chair. His eyes, once filled with boyish mischief, now bore the weariness of a man who had seen too much. He folded his arms across his chest and stared at Samuel, his voice breaking the tense silence. "What the hell happened to you?" Samuel averted his gaze, unable to meet the intensity in Miguel's eyes. "It's a long story," he muttered, his voice low, "but it's not an excuse." Miguel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It better be a damn good one, Sam. I'm about to decide your fate, and I need to know how the kid I grew up with ended up here." What followed was a flood of memories and confessions. Samuel recounted the horrors of war, the isolation he felt returning home, and the fateful mistake that had brought him to this point. He had intervened to protect a neighborhood kid ensnared in a debt with dangerous men. But what started as an act of protection escalated into a violent confrontation, leaving Samuel on the wrong side of the law. Miguel listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Samuel finished, the room was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Miguel leaned forward, his voice quieter but no less intense. "Sam, you always tried to save people. Even when we were kids, you couldn't stand by and watch someone get hurt. But now, you've put yourself in a position where I have to choose between justice and friendship." Miguel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the robe he had just removed still pressing on his shoulders. The man before him wasn't just any defendant. He was Samuel Martinez, his best friend, his brother in everything but blood. But the Samuel he saw now was almost unrecognizable. His eyes, once sharp and full of fire, were clouded with fatigue. His posture, once confident, sagged under an invisible burden. For a moment, Miguel hesitated. It wasn't just his job at stake. It was his conscience. "Sam," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "do you remember the first time we got into a fight together?" Samuel, seated stiffly across the room, looked up. The tension in his jaw loosened just enough to let a faint, ironic smile escape. "Which one? We were always in trouble." Miguel chuckled, the sound tinged with nostalgia. "No, the first one, 5th grade.
Carlos Mendoza.
Samuel's eyes lit up, though the light was fleeting, like a match struck in a storm. "Carlos," he said, leaning back as if the memory physically pulled him away from the present. "Yeah, I remember. You stole your backpack, dumped your books in the mud. You were too scared to do anything, so I—" Miguel cut him off, his grin widening. "You charged at him like a maniac and threw a punch so wild you ended up on the ground. Broke your wrist on the first swing, and he didn't even flinch." Samuel laughed, a genuine laugh that seemed foreign in this setting. For a brief moment, the sterile walls of the judge's chambers felt warmer, softer. "But he left you alone after that," Samuel added. "That's what mattered." Miguel nodded, his smile fading. "You've always been like that, charging in, taking the hit so someone else wouldn't have to. But Sam, not every fight is worth the cost." The room fell silent. Miguel studied his old friend's face, now lined with years of hardship. He saw the boy who once believed he could take on the world, and the man who now bore the scars of trying. Miguel straightened in his chair, the smile replaced by a mask of professionalism. "Sam, that was a playground fight. You've gone from breaking your wrist in 5th grade to whatever the hell this is." He gestured vaguely, as if the charges against Samuel were too overwhelming to list. "What happened to you?" Samuel's gaze dropped to the floor. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was low, heavy. "War happened to me, Miguel, and everything that comes with it." Miguel leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "You're not the only one who's served, Sam. I've seen plenty of veterans come through this courtroom. Most of them don't end up where you are. What makes you different?" Samuel's fists clenched on his lap. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Coming back and realizing the world you fought for doesn't have a place for you anymore. The medals, the parades, they don't mean anything when you're alone at night, trying to shut out the things you've seen." Miguel sat back, his face softening. He didn't interrupt. He let Samuel continue, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. "I came home, and it felt like I didn't belong anywhere. My wife left. My job prospects were a joke. I spent years trying to find some purpose, Miguel. Something that made me feel useful again." Samuel's voice cracked, and he looked away, ashamed. "Then I saw that kid, just a boy, caught up in something too big for him. I thought I could help. I thought maybe, if I saved him, I could save myself too." Miguel nodded slowly, absorbing the confession. He thought back to their teenage years, to the countless times Samuel had been the one to step in and shield others from harm. One memory in particular stood out, the night Miguel had crashed his father's car after sneaking out. They were 17, invincible, and stupid. Miguel had begged Samuel to join him for a midnight joyride, promising it would be quick and harmless. But a sharp turn on a wet road had turned the night into a disaster. The car's front end was crumpled against a tree, and Miguel was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack. "We're screwed," Miguel had said, pacing back and forth. "My dad's going to kill me. I'm dead. I'm freaking dead." Samuel had remained calm, as he always did in a crisis. He'd placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder and said, "We'll figure it out. Don't worry. I'll take the blame." And he had. Samuel had told the police he'd been driving, taken the brunt of Miguel's father's wrath, and spent weeks grounded. He'd missed the football tryouts they'd both dreamed of attending. "You always carried the weight for me," Miguel said now, snapping back to the present. "But this isn't high school, Sam. This time you've carried too much." Samuel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I know I screwed up, Miguel, but what else could I do? That kid, he was in trouble. I couldn't just walk away." Miguel's voice softened. "I'm not saying you should have walked away, but you can't keep throwing yourself into these situations without thinking. You're trying to save everyone but yourself." Samuel's eyes glistened, though he refused to let the tears fall. "Maybe I don't know how to save myself," The admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Miguel took a deep breath, then leaned forward, his tone quieter but no less firm. "Sam, you've got to start learning. You're no good to anyone, especially yourself, if you keep ending up here." The words cut deep, but Samuel nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know it would turn out like this." Miguel sighed and stood, signaling that their private conversation was over. "We'll finish this in the courtroom, but Sam, whatever happens next, remember this. You're not alone. Not anymore." The courtroom was silent as Samuel took the stand. His testimony was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. He spoke not just of the events that had led to his actions, but of the broader struggles veterans faced when returning to a world that often felt foreign. "I'm not asking for pity," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I'm asking for understanding. What I did wasn't right, but it came from a place of wanting to do something good. I let the weight of my past blind me to the right way to handle the present. I see that now." Miguel listened intently, his face unreadable. When the time came for his ruling, he took a deep breath, knowing that his decision would shape not just Samuel's future, but also his own understanding of justice and friendship. Miguel sat in his chambers late that night, long after the courtroom had emptied. The dim light from his desk lamp illuminated a stack of legal documents, but his focus was elsewhere. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, his mind a battlefield of emotions. The decision he had to make wasn't just about the law, it was personal. Samuel wasn't just another defendant. He was someone Miguel had grown up with, someone he owed more to than he could put into words. But Miguel also knew his position required impartiality. Justice couldn't afford personal bias, and yet the weight of that gavel felt heavier than it ever had before. He thought about Samuel's testimony, about the vulnerability in his friend's voice as he confessed to feeling lost in the world he'd returned to after the war. Miguel had heard similar stories from veterans before, but this one hit different. This was Samuel, his protector, his partner in childhood mischief, the kid who had taken the fall for his mistakes more times than he could count. Miguel's thoughts drifted back to the night after the car crash. Samuel had been grounded for weeks, his chance to try out for the football team slipping away. Miguel had made the team, but it felt hollow. Every time he stepped onto the field, he'd glance at the bleachers, half expecting to see Samuel cheering him on. But Samuel wasn't there. He was stuck at home, paying the price for Miguel's recklessness. One evening, Miguel had shown up at Samuel's window, football in hand. "Come on," he whispered, tapping the glass. "Let's go throw some passes." Samuel had hesitated but eventually climbed out, casting a wary glance toward the house. "You know I can't get caught, right?" Samuel said, smirking as Miguel tossed him the ball. "I know," Miguel replied, "but I couldn't do this without you, Sam. You're the reason I'm even on the team." That night, under the dim glow of a street lamp, they'd run drills until their arms ached. It was Samuel who had pushed Miguel to dream bigger, to strive for more. And now, decades later, Miguel wondered if he could ever repay that debt. Miguel stood and began pacing his chambers, the echoes of his footsteps mirroring the turmoil in his mind. He thought about the oath he'd taken as a judge, to uphold the law, to be fair, to serve justice. But what did justice look like here? Was it punishing Samuel for breaking the law? Or was it recognizing the circumstances that had driven him to act? He ran his fingers along the edge of his desk, pausing at a framed photo of his wife and kids. Miguel had built a stable life for himself, but he knew that stability wasn't guaranteed. Life was unpredictable, unforgiving. Samuel's life had taken a different path, one marred by war and loss, but it wasn't entirely his fault. "Am I betraying justice?" Miguel muttered to himself. "Or am I betraying him?" The gavel sat on the edge of the desk, a stark reminder of the power he held. It felt less like a symbol of authority and more like a millstone around his neck. Miguel wanted to believe that the law could be compassionate, that it could see past mistakes and offer second chances. But the law wasn't just about belief, it was about precedent, about rules. And rules didn't make exceptions for old friends. The memory that hit next wasn't one of camaraderie but of sacrifice. They were 18, celebrating their last summer before Samuel enlisted. Miguel had been accepted to college, but Samuel had chosen the military, saying it was his best shot at a future. They'd stood by the riverbank, tossing rocks into the water. Miguel had asked why Samuel was so eager to leave. "I need to do something bigger than this," Samuel had said, staring at the horizon. "Something that matters." "You matter here," Miguel had replied, but Samuel had just laughed. "Nah, man, you're the one with a future. Me? I'm just trying to find my place." Miguel had never forgotten those words. Samuel had gone off to fight wars in foreign lands while Miguel built a career in the safety of a courtroom. And now, here they were, two men who had started in the same place but ended up worlds apart. When Miguel finally returned to the courtroom the next morning, he felt the weight of every step. Samuel stood at the defendant's table, his posture straighter now, his expression resolute. Whatever Miguel decided, Samuel was ready to face it. Miguel's voice was steady as he read his decision. "Samuel Martinez, the law requires consequences for your actions. But the law also recognizes the importance of context and character. You acted out of a misguided sense of protection, not malice. Therefore," he paused, the room holding its breath, "I am sentencing you to community service and mandatory counseling. You'll work with local veterans programs, sharing your story and helping others who feel as lost as you have. This is not a free pass. It's an opportunity to rebuild." Samuel exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief. Miguel met his gaze, his voice softening. "And maybe, Sam, it's time you start saving yourself." Months had passed since Samuel's sentencing. Miguel often thought about his old friend, wondering if the choice he'd made as a judge had been the right one. Though he believed in second chances, he also knew that the path to redemption was never easy. Tonight, however, he would see the results for himself. Miguel arrived at the local Veterans Center, the air heavy with the crispness of early fall. The sound of laughter and murmured conversations floated out from the building, a warmth that contrasted with the chill of the evening. Miguel stepped inside and paused, his eyes scanning the room. There he was. Samuel sat in the middle of a circle of veterans, his posture no longer weighed down by invisible burdens. His voice carried through the room, not booming, but steady and calm. He was sharing a story, one that Miguel instantly recognized. "I'll never forget the first time I felt fear so deep it made me question who I was," Samuel said. "It wasn't in combat. It was when I came home, when I realized I didn't know how to live here anymore." The group nodded silently, their eyes fixed on Samuel. Miguel could see it, the understanding, the connection Samuel was forging. These men and women weren't just listening. They were healing together. Samuel continued, his voice thickening with emotion. "People think war breaks you on the battlefield, but that's not true. It breaks you when you're sitting in a quiet room, alone with the memories. It breaks you when you can't look at your family without wondering if you're still the same person they loved before. And for a long time, I thought I wasn't." Miguel leaned against the doorframe, unnoticed by the group. He watched as Samuel stood and placed a hand on the shoulder of the man next to him, a younger veteran who looked on the verge of tears. "But you know what I've learned?" Samuel's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "The pieces don't have to stay broken. They're still yours, and you can build something new with them even if it takes time." When the session ended, Miguel waited until the others had left before approaching Samuel. He stood there awkwardly for a moment, unsure how to begin. Samuel noticed him and broke into a smile, a real one, not the guarded expression Miguel had seen in the courtroom. "You're late," Samuel teased. "You missed the good part." Miguel chuckled, shaking his head. "Look at you," he said, gesturing around the room. "You're leading this place. I wasn't sure if you'd take the second chance, Sam, but seeing this, you've built something incredible." Samuel's smile faded slightly, replaced by something deeper, more reflective. "I almost didn't, Miguel," he admitted. "After the sentencing, I felt like I didn't deserve another chance. But then I met these guys, and I realized that maybe my story isn't just about me. Maybe it's about helping others who are still in the fight." Miguel sat down beside him, the weight of the moment settling over them. "You've always been the one to step in and fight for someone else," Miguel said softly. "It's who you are. I just didn't know if you could ever do that for yourself." Samuel looked at him, his eyes glassy but steady. "I didn't think I could either," he admitted. "But sometimes, Miguel, all it takes is for someone to believe in you, even when you don't." Miguel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He reached out and clasped Samuel's shoulder. "You've earned this, Sam, and I'm proud of you, not as a judge, but as your friend." Weeks later, Samuel stood in the dim light of his small apartment, pen in hand. A folded letter lay before him, addressed to a name that only existed in his memories. "Dear Lucas, it's been a long time since we last talked. Not a day goes by that I don't think about you. I'm writing because I finally found the words I've been searching for. I need to tell you that I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I carried the guilt of losing you for so long that I forgot what it means to live. But now, I understand something I wish I'd known back then. You didn't die because I failed. You died because war takes everything it touches. And I survived not because I deserved to, but because maybe I was meant to. Maybe it's my job now to keep your memory alive by helping others. I'll never stop missing you, but I'll carry your strength with me, always. Your brother in arms, Samuel." Samuel sealed the letter and placed it in a box filled with keepsakes from his time in the military. He didn't need to send it. It wasn't about where it went. It was about where it had taken him. Months later, Samuel and Miguel stood together at the Veterans Center's annual fundraiser. The room was filled with laughter and camaraderie, the kind that only came from shared struggles. Miguel raised a glass, his voice carrying over the crowd. "To second chances," he said, "and to those who fight not just on the battlefield, but here every single day." The room erupted into cheers, but Samuel remained quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Then he smiled, lifting his glass. "To those who didn't make it home," he added softly, "but who still live in every choice we make." As the crowd toasted, Miguel looked at Samuel and saw it clearly. A man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Not unscathed, but stronger with purpose. Together, they stood as living proof that even in the darkest moments, hope could be rebuilt, piece by piece.